The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl into a desert tunnel where a hidden journal exposed generations of lies. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold evening when the biker's Harley-Davidson roared down the desolate desert highway. Dust kicked up in clouds as the bike glided through the barren landscape, the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty road. Jake Reaper Morrison had spent the last 20 years with the Hells Angels, known for his fierce loyalty and unwavering toughness. He was a man with a past filled with scars, both seen and unseen. Tonight, however, something felt different. His instincts, honed over years of riding, told him to slow down. A sudden shift in the wind, a feeling of unease settled in his gut. He squinted through the dusk, and that's when he saw her, a little girl, no more than 10, standing by the side of the road. She was alone, her small figure almost blending into the vast emptiness around her. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He pulled the bike over and killed the engine. As he took off his helmet, he could feel his brow furrow with concern. The child's eyes locked onto his, and in them, Jake saw fear, but also something else, an unspoken plea for help. "Hey, you all right?" Jake called out, trying to mask the urgency in his voice. The girl hesitated, looking around, then slowly walked up to him. Her clothes were tattered, and her face was streaked with dirt, but what struck Jake most was the look in her eyes, like she had seen things no child should. "They told me not to tell anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't know what to do anymore." Jake bent down, crouching so he wouldn't tower over her. "Tell me what happened," he said softly. The girl glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might be following her. "There's a tunnel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daddy, he told me never to go there, but I saw it. I saw it today." Jake's mind raced as she spoke. The desert was vast, and tunnels weren't common. "Where's this tunnel?" he asked. She pointed toward the distant hills. "It's hidden. It's where everything is, everything about my family," she said. "There's a journal. It's the only thing left, and it has answers. It tells everything about the lies." The biker stood up, his decision made in an instant. His life had always been about following orders, protecting the brotherhood, and dealing with the roughest of situations, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of purpose, something bigger than himself pulling him into this mystery. "I'll help you," he said, without hesitation. The girl nodded, and together they began the journey toward the tunnel. The road was treacherous, and with each mile, the sky darkened, the air growing colder. As they reached the foot of the hills, Jake saw the faint outline of the tunnel entrance, hidden behind a cluster of rocks and desert brush. The girl led the way, moving quickly as if she had been here before. Jake's boots crunched on the gravel as he followed her, keeping his eyes peeled for any signs of danger. They reached the entrance, and the girl stepped aside, allowing Jake to go first. He looked into the darkness, the smell of damp earth filling his nostrils. Inside, it was cold, the air heavy with the scent of age-old secrets. "The journal's in there," the girl said, pointing toward a small alcove deep within the tunnel. Jake nodded and stepped forward, his heart pounding as he moved through the narrow passageway. With each step, the tension in the air grew. It wasn't just the silence of the tunnel. It was the feeling that something important, something life-altering, was about to be uncovered. When they reached the alcove, Jake knelt down and saw it. A small leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with time, was resting on a stone pedestal. He reached out and picked it up, flipping it open to the first page. The writing was faded, but the words still clear. "The truth has always been hidden in the darkness. Only the brave can face the lies that bind us." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The journal was more than just a collection of pages. It was a key to unraveling the twisted history of the girl's family, a history he was now tangled in. As Jake closed the journal, he turned to the girl, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. "This isn't over," Jake muttered under his breath, realizing that the journey ahead would reveal far more than he had ever expected. The tunnel stretched deeper into the earth, the faint glow from Jake's flashlight barely illuminating the walls around them. The air was thick, the silence almost oppressive, and every step felt like it carried more weight than the last. The girl, still close behind, had fallen quiet, her footsteps almost inaudible as she followed him deeper into the hidden passage. Jake could feel her presence, fragile yet resolute, as she clung to the hope that this journal would bring answers that she had been denied for too long. As they moved further into the tunnel, the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, and the sense of dread heightened. It was as if the tunnel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The journal Jake held in his hand felt heavy now, its leather cover worn and faded, as though it had been waiting for him for a long time. The farther they went, the more he could feel the weight of the generations of lies pressing down on him. Finally, they reached a small chamber, its stone walls smooth and polished as though they had been carved by hands long forgotten. At the center of the room was an altar, the stone pedestal where the journal had been resting now appearing like a sacred offering. It felt as though everything in this place had been designed to guard this secret, this forgotten truth. Jake placed the journal on the pedestal, careful not to damage it further, then stepped back. The girl stood beside him, her eyes wide with anticipation, her breath quickening as she awaited the answers she so desperately sought. He flipped open the first page, scanning the faded writing. The words were like echoes from another time, but they were clear enough for Jake to read. The lies will unravel when the blood is spilled. It began, and Jake felt a chill run through him. His fingers trembled as he turned the page. Each word seemed to reveal something more, like a thread being pulled from the fabric of a much larger story. The journal spoke of betrayal, of a legacy built on deceit, and of a family whose foundation had been constructed on the backs of those they had wronged. But as Jake read further, something caught his eye, a name. It was familiar, a name that tied back to the girl standing beside him. His heart skipped a beat as the realization dawned on him. This wasn't just the history of her family. It was his, too. Jake, the girl whispered, her voice breaking the silence. What does it mean? What does it say? He looked up at her, his mind racing as the weight of the truth began to settle over him. He didn't know how to answer her yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just her story. It was his now, too. He flipped through more pages, the words growing darker, more cryptic. The journal spoke of a pact, a secret agreement made by the girl's ancestors, one that had been hidden for generations. Jake had heard whispers of such things in his time with the Hells Angels, stories of men who had made deals with forces they couldn't understand. But this was something different. The journal detailed a betrayal so deep, so profound, that it had destroyed everything it touched. The girl's family, it seemed, had been tied to the Hells Angels in ways he never could have imagined. But the revelation was more than just a family secret. It was a legacy of violence, one that had been carefully hidden behind layers of lies. He could feel the weight of the history bearing down on him now. Jake felt his chest tighten as the pieces began to fall into place. This journal, this hidden treasure of truth, was more than just a collection of secrets. It was a key to understanding the darkness that had shaped his own life. His mind raced, but before he could make sense of it, a noise echoed from deeper in the tunnel. A low, rumbling sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned to the girl. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steady but urgent. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear but determination. They both stood frozen for a moment, listening. The rumble grew louder, more distinct. Something was coming. Jake's instincts kicked in. He knew they weren't alone anymore. The sounds of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from the darkness behind them. Someone, or something, was following them, closing in. His fingers tightened around the journal as he turned back to the girl. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, they rushed back down the tunnel, Jake's mind racing with the implications of what he had just read. But the deeper they went, the louder the rumble became, until it was deafening, shaking the very walls of the tunnel. Something was waiting, something Jake couldn't yet see but could feel in his bones. As they emerged from the tunnel, a wave of cold air hit them, and Jake realized that the storm had returned, the desert wind howling with renewed fury. He didn't know what was waiting for them outside, but he knew this much: there was no turning back. They had uncovered the first layer of the truth, but the journey was far from over. And now, with every step, the weight of generations of lies was closing in on them. The wind howled through the narrow passage as Jake and the girl sprinted out of the tunnel, the air growing colder with every step. The sounds of footsteps that had haunted them in the dark seemed to grow closer, but when they reached the open desert, there was nothing. The storm had returned with a vengeance, the night sky now a swirling mass of dark clouds and flashing lightning. Jake's boots kicked up sand as he scanned the horizon, his senses on high alert. He turned to the girl. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and urgent. The girl nodded, fear etched across her face, but determination in her eyes. They had uncovered the truth, the lies of her family, their connection to Jake's own life. But now it felt like they were walking straight into a storm. "We can't stay out here long," Jake muttered, adjusting his grip on the journal. It felt like a weight he couldn't shake, a burden that grew heavier the more he understood about its contents. The wind howled again, and the storm pushed forward, making visibility near impossible. It wasn't just the weather they had to worry about now. Jake's mind raced. The footsteps in the tunnel, the rumble that had seemed so distant at first, now felt like a warning. Someone, or something, was coming for them. The journal had opened up a door to a past full of secrets and lies, but it had also opened a door to danger. As they trudged through the sand, the girl's hand found his. It was small and trembling, but it was a connection, a lifeline in the storm. "What's going to happen to us?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain it, how to tell her that their lives were about to be changed forever. "I don't know," he finally said. "But we're going to face it together." The words felt hollow, but they were all he had. As they continued walking, Jake felt the weight of the journal in his hand again, the answers hidden within its pages. He knew that the next steps would be crucial. He had already seen how deep the lies ran. Her family, his family, they were all tangled up in this web of deception. But what did it all mean? The storm raged around them, but the tunnel behind them remained silent. There were no more footsteps, no more sounds. Just the deafening howls of the desert wind. The girl's grip tightened on his hand. "Do you think it's over?" Jake shook his head. "No," he said, his voice hardening. "This is just the beginning." He glanced over at her. The innocence in her eyes was a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. She didn't know it yet, but her life would never be the same. They couldn't keep running, not anymore. He had made his choice, and now they would face whatever came next. They reached a small, dilapidated building in the distance, barely visible through the storm. The girl pointed. "There," she said, her voice full of hope. "It's safe there." Jake nodded. It was the first sign of something familiar in a place that felt so foreign. They made their way to the building, the wind pushing against them with every step. The door creaked open as Jake pushed it, revealing a dark, empty interior. There were no lights, no signs of life, but the building had a strange sense of stillness to it, like it had been waiting for them. "We'll stay here for now," Jake said, looking around. The girl nodded and stepped inside, her small form barely visible in the shadows. Jake followed her in, closing the door behind him. He could hear the storm's fury outside, but inside, there was a quiet, almost oppressive silence. The walls of the building were bare, the floor covered in dust and debris. But it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. "What happens now?" the girl asked, breaking the silence. Jake didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the journal in his hands again, the secrets it held pressing down on him. He needed to know more, but he couldn't do it alone. "We need to find someone who can help us," he said, his voice steady. "Someone who knows about this, about the history, about the lies." The girl looked up at him, her face a mixture of confusion and fear. "Who?" Jake hesitated. He didn't know who had the answers, but he knew one thing. Whoever they were coming for them. He could feel it in the air. The storm was a warning, but the truth, the real truth, was far more dangerous. The journal had set everything in motion, but now it was time to face the consequences. As he glanced back at the girl, he knew there was no turning back. The storm was just the beginning, and their journey was far from over. The storm outside raged on, its fury shaking the walls of the old building, but inside, the air was thick with silence. Jake stood by the window, staring out into the dark, his eyes scanning the horizon. The storm had taken everything in its path, leaving the desert cold and unforgiving. But for the first time in days, Jake felt a sense of stillness. He could hear the girl moving around the room behind him, her soft footsteps as she explored the dim interior. He didn't know how long they would be able to stay there. The building, though seemingly abandoned, felt more like a trap than a safe haven. He turned back to her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. The girl was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked up at him, her face drawn with exhaustion, but there was a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Jake pause. He walked over to her and sat down beside her, the dust from the floor sticking to his jeans as he settled in. The journal sat between them, its leather cover worn but still holding the secrets that had begun to unravel everything. "We need to figure out what this all means," Jake said, his fingers tracing the edges of the journal. "We've got the truth now, but the lies are still out there." The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't just sit here and wait for answers to fall into their laps. Whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated the lies, wasn't going to let them walk away without consequences. "We find out who's behind all of this," Jake said, his voice firm. "And we make them pay for what they've done." She nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was just a child, but she had already seen too much. This journey they were on was bigger than both of them, and he wasn't sure how far they could go before it all came crashing down. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a wild animal. Inside, the silence felt suffocating, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake stood up, pacing the room. His thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. Who was trying to keep this hidden? What had they done to protect their lives? And most importantly, how far would they go to make sure the truth stayed buried? As he turned back to the girl, his eyes hardened. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice resolute. "We need to keep moving. Whoever is behind this is getting closer, and we're not safe." The girl stood up, her hand clutching the journal tightly. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together a plan. He thought back to the last time he'd been involved in something like this. The chaos, the violence, the way everything seemed to spiral out of control. But this time, it felt different. He wasn't just protecting himself or the Hell's Angels. He was protecting her, a child who had been caught in a web of lies that spanned generations. "I know someone who can help us," Jake said, his voice steady. Child should have to witness, and yet she was still holding on, still fighting for answers. "You sure about this?" Jake asked, breaking the silence between them. "You don't have to keep going if you're scared." The girl looked up at him, her eyes unwavering, her voice steady. "I'm not scared," she said simply. "I just want to know what happened. What they did to my family. To me." Jake nodded, his heart heavy. He could understand her desire for answers. He too was searching for something that could explain the twisted chain of events that had brought them together. They had both been caught in a web of lies that had been spun for generations. And now, it seemed they were the only ones who could unravel them. They had traveled far, but the road was still long. Jake could feel the weight of the journey pressing on him, but he couldn't turn back now. Not after everything they had discovered. Not after what they had already uncovered in the journal. They had no choice but to continue. The girl's family, it seemed, was tied to something much bigger than they had ever realized. As they walked on, Jake's thoughts returned to the journal. It was filled with cryptic messages and fragmented stories, but it had also revealed one undeniable truth. The girl's family had been keeping secrets. Secrets that went back decades. Secrets that involved people Jake had known, people who were no longer around to answer for their actions. His mind raced, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slip into place. The journal mentioned something about a deal, a pact made between two powerful families. Jake had heard rumors of such things before, whispers in the shadows of the motorcycle world, but he never thought they would be connected to his own life. As they approached a small, dilapidated building, Jake felt a sense of unease. It was tucked away in the far corner of the desert, hidden behind a wall of rocks and cactus. The structure was barely standing, its walls crumbling and its roof sagging with age. But Jake knew it was the place. He had come here before, many years ago, though not for a reason like this. He motioned for the girl to follow him as they walked toward the entrance. "Stay close," he warned, his voice low. The girl nodded and stuck close to him, her hand gripping his sleeve as they moved toward the door. Jake pushed it open, the old wood creaking in protest, and they stepped inside. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of mildew and dust. The room was empty, save for a few scattered remnants of old furniture and boxes. The girl looked around, her eyes wide as she took in the surroundings. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is where the truth is," he said quietly. "This is where everything connects, where the lies began." He led her further into the room, stopping in front of a large wooden chest in the corner. It was old, the wood faded and chipped, but it had a certain weight to it. Jake bent down and opened the chest, revealing a collection of papers and old photographs, all covered in dust. He sifted through the papers, his fingers brushing against the faded images of men and women he had once known. "This is it," Jake murmured, pulling out a stack of letters and photographs. The girl leaned in, her eyes scanning the contents. "These are my grandparents," she said, her voice trembling. Jake looked at the photos and saw the same faces, the same names that had appeared in the journal. This was no coincidence. The pieces were coming together, but they were far from the whole picture. "This isn't just about your family," Jake said, his voice growing darker. "This is about the deals, the betrayals, the people who covered it all up." The girl stared at him, her face pale. "What do you mean? Who are these people?" Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing with the weight of the truth. "These are the people who made the pact, the people who buried the truth." He turned the photograph around, pointing to a man in the back. "That man," Jake said, his finger tracing the edge of the photo, "was my mentor, and he knew about the lies. He helped bury them." The girl's eyes widened. "What happened to him?" Jake's hand clenched into a fist. "He's dead, and the lies he helped protect are still alive. They've been passed down, buried under the weight of secrets. But it's time. They came to light." The girl swallowed hard, her eyes searching Jake's face. "What do we do now?" Jake stood up, his resolve hardening. "Now, we go after them," he said, his voice low but full of certainty. "We find the people who started this, and we make them answer for everything." The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the journal. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady. "Let's finish this." The night was closing in around them as Jake and the girl continued down the winding desert road, the distant hum of the engine cutting through the silence of the vast, empty landscape. The storm had subsided, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the cold bite of the desert night. Jake's mind raced, each mile taking them closer to the answers they sought, but also closer to the danger that lurked in the shadows. The journal he had found, now safely tucked away in his bag, had revealed more than he was ready for. But there was still so much to uncover. He could feel it in his gut. Something bigger was at play, something darker. The girl sat quietly beside him, her eyes fixed ahead, her hands still gripping the journal tightly. She had been through so much already, and Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. But she was stronger than she knew, stronger than anyone could have expected. "We're getting closer," Jake said, his voice low, almost to himself. "We'll get to the truth, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next." The girl didn't respond immediately, her gaze still locked on the road. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I'm ready," she said. Jake glanced at her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. She had been quiet for most of the journey, but something in her tone now told him she had made up her mind. She was no longer just a frightened child. She had become part of this, part of the mission. "I know you are," Jake replied, his voice filled with respect. The miles passed, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. Jake's thoughts turned back to the journal. The more he read, the more the pieces started to fall into place, but there were still gaps, things he didn't fully understand. The journal spoke of a pact made long ago, a secret kept by her family and by his own. But what was the cost of that pact? And why had it been hidden for so long? He glanced at the girl again, the weight of her family's history pressing on his shoulders as well. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was his too. He had seen things in the journal, things that were too familiar, too close to his own past. The storm inside him had been brewing for years, but now, with every mile they covered, it felt like it was about to break free. They reached a small town, a blink-and-you-miss-it kind of place, but Jake knew it was where they had to stop. He pulled into a parking lot of a rundown motel, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the dusty streets. "We'll rest here for a bit," Jake said, stopping the bike. "We need to figure out our next move." The girl nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings, a mix of curiosity and unease on her face. Jake could tell she didn't trust the place, and he couldn't blame her. It was a far cry from the safety they had hoped for. But they didn't have the luxury of being choosy. "Stay close," he added, pulling off his helmet. "We don't know who's watching." As they entered the motel, the air inside was stale, the flickering light from the single overhead bulb casting long shadows on the cracked walls. The receptionist, an older man with weary eyes, barely looked up as they walked past him. Jake led the girl to a room at the back, the door creaking open with a low groan. The room was sparse, just a bed and a small table by the window, but it would have to do. Jake set the journal on the table and locked the door behind them. "Get some rest," he told her, his tone softer now. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." The girl didn't respond right away. She stood by the window, looking out at the darkened town, her small form silhouetted against the dim light from the street. After a long pause, she turned to him. "Jake, do you think we'll ever be safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake walked over to her, his boots silent on the worn floor. He could hear the uncertainty in her words, the fear she was still holding on to, no matter how brave she appeared. He didn't have an answer, at least not one that would make her feel better. But he had to try. "We're not in this alone," he said, his voice firm. "We have each other, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "You don't know what they'll do," she said softly. "They'll come after us, won't they?" Jake didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that clung to you like a shadow, always just behind you. He had lived with it for years, and now, it seemed, the girl would have to live with it too. "They can try," Jake said, "but they won't succeed." The girl nodded, though Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. He knew it wasn't enough to calm her, but it was all he had for now. As he turned to look at the journal again, the weight of the truth pressing on him, Jake knew the next steps would be the most dangerous yet. They had uncovered part of the mystery, but the rest of it, the heart of it, was still out there, waiting to be found. And once they discovered it, there would be no going back. The storm that had been building inside him was ready to break, and when it did, it would change everything. The morning after, the air in the motel room felt dense with tension. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the quiet streets of the small town. The storm from the night before had passed, but the uneasy silence that followed hung in the air like a warning. He could feel it. Something was coming, and he knew that they were running out of time. The girl was still asleep on the bed behind him, her body curled up under the worn blanket, a far cry from the fearless child who had stood beside him only hours ago. She looked so fragile now, as though the weight of the truth had taken all the strength from her. Jake had promised himself he would protect her, no matter what, but as the minutes ticked by, doubt began to creep into his mind. How could he protect her when the enemy they were facing was so much bigger than either of them could imagine? He turned back to the table where the journal lay open. The words on the pages had begun to haunt him, their cryptic messages painting a picture of a family caught in a web of deception, but they weren't the only ones tangled in it. The deeper he read, the more it became clear that his own past was tied to hers. The truth, the full truth, was still buried, and only by unearthing it would they have any hope of survival. But the cost of doing so was becoming more apparent with every passing moment. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she rubbed them, a soft groan escaping her lips. Jake didn't speak right away. Instead, he watched as she sat up, taking in the disheveled state of the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on her as much as it did on him. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet. But there was a note of resolve in it that Jake couldn't ignore. He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had made a promise, but the path they were about to take was uncertain. There was no guarantee they would make it through this. But there was no turning back now. "We have to find them," Jake finally said, his voice steady. The ones who made the pact. The ones who've been hiding the truth for all these years. And we have to make them pay. The girl looked at him, her expression unreadable. She was still processing everything. And Jake knew that even though she was holding up, the emotional weight of this journey was starting to wear on her. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm. Jake nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I know you're not. But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about what they've done to everyone. What they've kept hidden for generations." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the journal again. "Where do we even start?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jake took a deep breath, the reality of their situation sinking in. They didn't have the luxury of time. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that whoever was chasing them would catch up. They had to act fast. He thought for a moment, his mind sifting through the details, trying to find a lead. Then it clicked. "There's someone who might know," Jake said, turning to face her. "Someone who's been involved in this kind of thing before. They can help us." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Jake hesitated, his mind flashing to the past. "His name is Sam," Jake said, his voice darkening. "He used to be a part of the club. He knows about the deals, the secrets. He was involved in things I don't even like to remember." The girl didn't respond right away. She was still processing, but Jake could see the determination in her eyes. She trusted him, and for better or worse, she was in this with him now. "Where is he?" she asked after a long pause. "He's not far," Jake replied. "But it won't be easy getting to him. He's disappeared off the grid, living in a place no one knows about. We'll have to track him down, and that's going to take some work." The girl stood up, her posture straight, her resolve set. "Let's go then," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake watched her for a moment, surprised at how much strength she had. She had become more than just a passenger in this journey. She was an active participant. She was no longer the scared child who had stumbled into the world of darkness. She was someone willing to face it head-on, no matter the cost. He grabbed the journal from the table and tucked it into his jacket, feeling the weight of it settle against his chest. "All right," Jake said, his voice firm. "We're going to find Sam, and we're going to make this right." They left the motel room, the door creaking as it closed behind them. Jake led the girl out into the cold morning air, the wind still biting, but not as fierce as it had been the night before. They mounted the bike, Jake taking the lead, and the girl gripping onto him tightly. As the engine roared to life, Jake's thoughts swirled with what they might find, but one thing was clear, they couldn't stop now. They were on the edge of something much bigger than they had ever anticipated, and there was no going back. They would have to face whatever awaited them in the desert, because the truth was out there, hidden beneath the lies, and they would do whatever it took to expose it. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Jake and the girl rode through the desolate stretch of highway, the wind biting through their clothes and the cold settling deep into their bones. Jake's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts churning with the weight of everything that had happened. They were getting closer to Sam, closer to the answers they both needed. But as the miles ticked by, a sense of dread grew inside him. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about confronting a past he had tried to bury for years. The girl, holding tightly onto him, seemed lost in her own thoughts. Jake could feel her grip tightening with each passing mile. But there was something different about her now. She wasn't the scared little girl who had stumbled into this world of lies. She had grown stronger, more determined, just like him. But that strength came at a cost. She had already seen too much, and Jake knew that there was no turning back for either of them. As they neared their destination, Jake's mind flickered back to the journal they had found, the words etched on the yellowing pages that had revealed the tangled web of betrayal and deceit. He had thought he was prepared for whatever truths lay ahead, but the deeper they went, the more the past seemed to rise up to meet them. The girl glanced up at him, her face illuminated by the fading light. "Do you think we'll be able to fix this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer right away. He had never been one to make promises, especially ones he couldn't keep. But as they rode through the night, he knew that the only thing he could promise her now was that he would protect her, no matter what. "We'll do what we have to do," he said finally, his voice steady. "We'll find the truth, and we'll make sure no one can hide behind their lies anymore." The girl nodded, her expression distant but resolute. As they approached a small, isolated cabin at the edge of town, Jake slowed the bike and pulled off the road. The cabin looked abandoned, the windows boarded up and the door hanging crooked on its hinges. It was the kind of place that could easily be overlooked, just another piece of forgotten land in the desert. But Jake knew better. This was where Sam had been hiding, the last person who could help them piece together the puzzle. The girl looked at the cabin, her face shadowed with uncertainty. "Are you sure he's here?" she asked. Jake gave a slow nod. "This is where he's been for years. He'll be here." He dismounted the bike and walked toward the cabin, the girl following closely behind him. The air was thick with silence, the only sound their footsteps crunching in the gravel. As they reached the door, Jake stopped. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low. The girl nodded, her eyes wide but filled with determination. Jake pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air stale with years of disuse. But there was a faint smell of tobacco and something else, something familiar. "Sam," Jake called out, his voice echoing through the empty room. The sound of shuffling footsteps came from the back, followed by the soft click of a light switch. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man whose face was worn with age and scars, his eyes sharp but tired. Sam was no longer the man Jake had once known. The years had taken their toll on him, but there was still a fire in his eyes, a fire that had been hidden for a long time. "Jake," Sam said, his voice gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I didn't expect to see you again." Jake took a step forward, his expression hard. "We need your help, Sam," he said. "We need to know everything about the pact. About what happened. About the lies." Sam's eyes flickered to the girl standing behind Jake, her face shadowed in the dim light. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You brought her here?" he asked, his tone cautious. "She's part of this now," Jake said firmly. "She deserves to know the truth." Sam sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "The truth?" he muttered, his voice full of regret. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Jake. Some things are better left buried." Jake's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for your regrets, Sam. We need to fix this. You're the only one who knows what happened." Sam turned away, walking over to a dusty table where several old maps and documents were scattered. He picked up a worn folder, flipping through the papers inside before handing it to Jake. "This is everything," Sam said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The deal was made long ago, between families that should have never been involved. It was about power, control, and greed. And it cost everyone. Jake took the folder, feeling the weight of Sam's words settle in his chest. As he flipped through the pages, he saw the names of people he hadn't thought about in years, names that had been buried along with the lies. This wasn't just about the girl's family. It was about his own, too. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the picture they were forming was darker than he could have imagined. "You have to stop this," Sam continued, his voice cracking. "You can't fix what's been broken." Jake looked up from the folder, his eyes steely with determination. "We're not walking away from this. We're finishing it." Sam hesitated, then nodded. "You're making a mistake, Jake. But I won't stop you." He turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The girl, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with strength. "We'll make it right," she said, her eyes steady. Sam looked at her, his gaze unreadable. After a long pause, he sighed and pulled a small box from under the table. "If you're going through with this," he said, handing the box to Jake, "take this. It's the last piece of the puzzle." Jake took the box, feeling the weight of what was inside. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sam didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. They were on their own now. The truth was out there, and they would stop at nothing to uncover it. The weight of the small box in Jake's hands felt heavier with each passing moment, as if it held the answers to a question he had never dared to ask. The old cabin felt more oppressive now, the air thick with anticipation and the quiet hum of impending danger. The girl stood beside him, her small frame tense but unwavering. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. Jake glanced at Sam, who was still sitting by the table, his face marked with the years of regret. Sam didn't say anything. The room was filled with the unspoken understanding that the path they were about to take was one of no return. The storm outside had subsided, but the weight of everything they had uncovered, everything they were about to uncover, made the air feel just as heavy. Jake opened the small box slowly, the creak of the lid sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside was a faded photograph and a key. The photograph showed a younger Sam, standing next to a man Jake instantly recognized, his father. A surge of shock ran through him. He had known, deep down, that his father's past had been tied to this mess, but seeing it laid out before him was something entirely different. The key was old, rusted, and shaped strangely, like it could open something more than just a door. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice tight with a mix of confusion and anger. Sam sighed heavily, his gaze dropping to the floor. "That photograph is from a time before you were born, Jake," Sam began, his voice hoarse. "Back when your father was involved in all of this. He was part of the deal, part of the pact. This key, it's not just a key to a room. It's the key to understanding everything. The whole truth." Jake felt his heart race as he looked down at the key, his fingers curling around it instinctively. The truth, the real truth, was finally within his reach, but something in his gut told him that it wasn't going to be as simple as just unlocking a door. "What do I need to do with this?" Jake asked, his voice low, filled with a sense of urgency. Sam stood up slowly, his eyes clouded with something that might have been regret or fear. "You need to go to the old warehouse on the outskirts of town," Sam said, his voice tight. "It's where it all started. Your father left it locked away, but that key, it'll open a door you don't want to walk through." Jake nodded, slipping the key into his jacket pocket. The girl looked between Sam and Jake, her face reflecting the same uncertainty Jake felt. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. "I'm sure. We've come too far to turn back now." He turned back to Sam. "Where exactly is this warehouse?" Sam gave a slight nod, a somber look crossing his face. "It's out by the old factory district, just beyond the train tracks. There's an abandoned building there, but it's not really abandoned. Your father made sure no one would find it. Not without the key." Jake stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of Sam's words. The girl, still standing beside him, was quiet, but Jake could see the determination in her eyes. She had come this far, and there was no stopping her now. Jake knew that she would follow him into that warehouse, no matter what they found inside. He was going to finish this, even if it meant facing the demons of his own past. "We'll leave now," Jake said, his voice steady. Sam nodded, his gaze lingering on them both. "Be careful, Jake," he said quietly. "What you find there, it's going to change everything." With those words, Jake turned and walked toward the door, the girl following close behind. He felt the weight of the journal in his pocket, the key now resting there as well, the promise of truth heavy on his mind. They left the cabin, the cold night air hitting them as they stepped outside. The bike roared to life, the engine loud in the stillness, as they headed toward the outskirts of town. The warehouse was waiting for them, and with it, the final piece of the puzzle. The desert stretched out before them, empty and unforgiving, but Jake knew that the answers lay ahead. They would confront the lies, the betrayal, and the darkness that had haunted them both for too long. As the bike sped through the night, Jake's mind raced with the possibilities. What would they find in that warehouse? The truth? Or something darker, something that would make everything they had uncovered so far seem like nothing more than the beginning of a much larger story? He didn't know, but he was about to find out. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. There was no going back now. The ride to the warehouse felt endless, the bike roaring against the wind as the night stretched on. Jake's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the key in his pocket. What was hidden in that warehouse? What was his father involved in, and how far did the lies go? The further they rode, the more questions piled up. The girl sat behind him, her arms tight around his waist, but he could feel her tension. She was nervous, but more than that, she was determined. She had come this far, and now, they were almost at the place where everything would finally make sense. The headlights illuminated the darkened streets, and as they turned onto a quiet, isolated road, Jake could see the faint outline of the old factory district in the distance. The buildings here were abandoned, their windows broken, their walls weathered by years of neglect. This was the kind of place people forgot about, where secrets could be buried without a second thought. The warehouse stood at the end of the street, dark and foreboding, the only building still seemingly alive in this forsaken corner of the world. Jake pulled the bike to a stop in front of it, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. He turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The girl slid off the bike, her eyes fixed on the looming structure. "This is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer at first. He just stared at the warehouse, feeling the weight of everything they had uncovered so far. "This is it," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. He looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the strength. "We're not going back now," he added. "Whatever's inside there, we're facing it together." She nodded, her grip tightening on the journal. They both knew there was no turning back. The lies had been buried here for too long, and they were about to unearth them. Jake walked toward the entrance, the girl following close behind. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the heavy metal groaning under the strain. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. The warehouse was vast, its ceiling towering overhead, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracks in the walls. They stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty space. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, but he pushed forward, determined to find what they had come for. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The place felt alive with the echoes of the past, the walls holding secrets that had been waiting to be uncovered. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps muffled on the dirt floor. The girl's hand brushed against Jake's sleeve, a small gesture, but one that reminded him they were in this together. They reached a large steel door at the back of the warehouse, its surface rusted and scarred. Jake pulled out the key Sam had given him, his fingers trembling slightly as he inserted it into the lock. There was a click, and the door swung open with a creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, a single wooden table stood in the center, covered with old papers and files. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with dusty boxes and crates, the remnants of a time long gone. Jake walked into the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the table. He reached for one of the papers, his fingers brushing over the yellowed edges. As he unfolded it, he saw a familiar name, his father. The document was a contract, written in a language Jake didn't recognize, but the signatures at the bottom were clear. His father's name was there, along with others he didn't know, but the implications were clear. The pact, the deal that had been made all those years ago, was real. He turned to the girl, his voice low. "This is it. This is what we've been looking for." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the papers. "What does it say?" she asked. Jake looked down at the document again, his mind racing. "It's a contract," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "A deal between families. The kind of deal that was meant to stay buried." He picked up another piece of paper, his eyes scanning the contents. It detailed arrangements, promises made, and debts owed. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, control over something far darker than anything he had imagined. The girl reached out, her fingers brushing against Jake's. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Now? We finish this," he said. "We expose the truth. We let everyone know what happened here." As he spoke, he felt a shift within himself. The past had been dragging him down for so long, but now, it was time to break free. The lies had built walls around him, but those walls were crumbling. He would make sure of it. The girl looked up at him, her face set with determination. "Let's do it," she said, her voice strong. Jake nodded, his gaze returning to the papers on the table. This was the moment that would change everything. The truth was finally within reach, but they weren't just going to uncover it. They were going to use it to tear down everything that had been built on lies. The storm inside him had been building for years, but now, with every step forward, it was finally beginning to break. The final chapter was about to be written, and Jake was going to make sure it was his story to tell. Jake stood over the table, the weight of the papers in his hands heavier than ever. The truth was laid out before him. Everything he had been searching for, everything that had haunted his past, was now visible. The deal, the betrayal, the lies that spanned generations. His father's name was etched into the documents, marking him as one of the architects of this dark legacy. His hands tightened around the papers, a mix of anger and disbelief surging through him. The girl stood beside him, her eyes scanning the papers, But Jake could see the quiet storm brewing inside her as well. She had come into this world of shadows with nothing but questions, and now, like him, she had a piece of the puzzle that would change everything. Is this really it? She asked quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. Jake's gaze lingered on the papers, the contracts, and the names written in ink, names that were tied to a history of betrayal he couldn't quite comprehend. This is the beginning, Jake muttered. But it's not over yet. He turned to face her, his mind racing. We need to get these documents out, show everyone the truth. But we also need to be careful. The girl nodded, but Jake could tell she was still processing everything. They had come to this place seeking answers, but the answers were more than they had bargained for. The storm inside him, the one that had been building for years, was threatening to break free. He had always known there was something off about his family's past, something buried deep, but this was a nightmare. And yet, he couldn't look away. What do we do now? The girl asked, her voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. Jake met her gaze, his face hardening with resolve. We finish it, he said. We expose the people who started this. We don't let them get away with it any longer. He took a deep breath and looked back at the warehouse door, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. He knew they weren't alone in this fight. As if on cue, he heard the distant rumble of engines approaching, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles. His heart skipped a beat. Get ready, Jake whispered to the girl, his voice low. She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. They both knew this was the moment they had been waiting for, the point where the truth would be exposed, and there would be no turning back. The sound of engines grew louder, and the unmistakable roar of motorcycles filled the air. Jake's fingers brushed against the handle of his gun, his mind quickly shifting to the reality that they had become targets. They had uncovered too much, and now there were people who would do anything to stop them from revealing what was hidden. The girl stood behind him, her grip on the journal tight. Who are they? She whispered. Jake didn't answer right away. He knew who they were. Those who had kept the lies alive. Those who would kill to protect their secrets. The motorcycle screeched to a halt outside the warehouse, and Jake tensed, ready for whatever came next. The sound of footsteps approaching the door followed. Jake's hand gripped the gun at his side, his muscles coiling in preparation. He could hear the voices now, low and menacing, but the words were indistinguishable. Whoever was outside wasn't here for a friendly chat. Get behind me, Jake said to the girl, his voice commanding. She did as he asked, her body pressed against the wall, her breath quickening in the tense silence. He could hear the men outside, their heavy boots thudding on the gravel, the sound of muffled voices growing louder. Then, a single, sharp knock echoed from the door. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved toward it, his body tense, and opened it just enough to peer outside. 4 men stood in front of him, all of them dressed in black leather jackets, their faces obscured by sunglasses and hard expressions. The one in front stepped forward, his eyes scanning Jake's face with an unsettling intensity. You've been asking too many questions, the man said, his voice low and dangerous. And now, it's time to pay for that. Jake didn't flinch. He knew this was coming. They were here to silence him and the girl. He wasn't about to let that happen. What's in those papers? The man asked, his gaze shifting to the stack of documents on the table. I don't know what you're talking about, Jake said coolly, his hand still resting on the doorframe, blocking their way. The man didn't seem convinced. You're lying, he spat. And you know it. Jake's mind raced. He could feel the girl's presence behind him, her breath shaky but still determined. She wasn't backing down either. Jake could see that now. You're too late, Jake said, his voice firm. The truth is already out. You can't stop it anymore. The man's eyes narrowed. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Jake replied, his voice steady. And I'm not afraid of you. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced back at the other 3 men, and they shared a silent look. Then, without warning, the man lunged at Jake, his fist swinging toward him. But Jake was ready. He dodged the punch, spinning to the side, and grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back. I told you, Jake said through gritted teeth, the truth is coming out. Whether you like it or not. The fight broke out in an instant, the men rushing at Jake. But he fought back with the same intensity, using every ounce of skill he had honed over the years. The girl stood frozen for a moment, watching the chaos unfold, but then she stepped forward. Jake, she shouted, her voice full of urgency. We have to go now. Jake glanced back at her, his eyes flashing with the determination he had kept hidden for so long. We're not done yet, he said, his voice steady. But we'll leave together. I promise. With one final move, Jake disarmed the man in front of him, knocking him to the ground. The other men hesitated for a moment, but Jake knew this was their chance. They had to get out. Now, Jake said. Together, they ran toward the exit, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence behind them. The fight was far from over, but at least for now, they had escaped. The truth was out there, and they were going to make sure it was heard. Jake's heart pounded as he sprinted down the alleyway, the girl close behind him. The sounds of their footsteps echoed in the empty streets, but behind them, the chaos was still unfolding. The men in black leather jackets hadn't been knocked down for long. They would be back on their feet soon, and when they were, they'd come for Jake and the girl with everything they had. He could feel the weight of the documents in his jacket pocket, the truth that had been buried for so long. His mind raced, calculating their next move. He had made a promise to her. He would protect her no matter what, but this wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. This was about taking control of their lives and exposing the lies that had been keeping them trapped. The girl was keeping pace with him, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she struggled to keep up. Jake glanced over his shoulder. Keep up, he said, his voice hard but encouraging. She nodded, determination shining in her eyes. They didn't have time to waste. The abandoned buildings they passed were a blur in the night, but there was one place Jake had in mind. A hidden safe house where they could regroup and plan their next move. They couldn't go back to the warehouse. They needed a place to lay low, somewhere no one would think to look for them. He spotted a small door at the end of the street, barely visible in the shadows. There, Jake said, nodding toward it. We'll head inside. We'll figure this out. As they approached the door, Jake's hand hovered over his gun. His instincts were on high alert, but he didn't hear anyone approaching. The tension in the air was thick, but he kept moving. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and they slipped inside. The dim light from a single bulb overhead cast eerie shadows across the room. Jake quickly scanned the area, confirming that they were alone. It was a small, sparsely furnished room, just a bed, a table, and a few old chairs, but it would do for now. Jake locked the door behind them and exhaled slowly. They were safe, for the moment. He turned to the girl, who was standing by the window, her eyes wide with uncertainty. You okay? Jake asked. She nodded slowly, though her expression was distant. I'm just trying to understand it all, she said quietly. Everything that's happened. Why my family kept all this from me. Why they let it go on for so long. Jake walked over to her, his gaze softening. He had seen that look before. The look of someone who was realizing that everything they thought they knew about the world was a lie. You'll understand soon enough, he said. Once we get to the bottom of this. But for now, you need to focus on staying safe. We can't let them get to us. The girl turned to face him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. I don't care about the danger, she said firmly. I want to know what happened to my family. I want to know why they betrayed me. Why they betrayed us. Jake could hear the emotion in her voice, the raw anger and the pain she had been carrying for so long. He didn't have all the answers, but he could understand her desire for closure. We'll get the answers, he said, his voice steady. But we need to stay focused. We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap. He looked around the room, taking note of the exits and the shadows. The place felt safe, but he knew they couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. We'll stay here tonight, he continued. And tomorrow we go after the people behind all of this. But we need to figure out who they are and how they're connected to everything. We need to find out who's been lying to us and why. The girl nodded, her expression set with determination. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. We have to stop them. Jake studied her for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. He knew she was ready, but he also knew that the road ahead would be full of danger. He wasn't sure if they were strong enough to take down the people who had kept the lies buried for so long. But one thing was certain, he would fight alongside her until the end. The silence in the room grew heavy, the only sound the occasional creak of the building settling. Jake turned toward the table, pulling out the papers Sam had given him. He spread them out across the surface, his eyes scanning the text. The more he read, the more he realized that they were facing a network, an underground organization that stretched far beyond what he had originally believed. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about taking down a powerful force that had controlled everything for far too long. He could feel the weight of it, the responsibility, the danger. But he couldn't turn back now. He would see it through, for her. For both of them. "We'll make them pay," Jake said, his voice low but full of conviction. The girl didn't say anything in response, but the look she gave him said everything. She was ready. And so was he. They would face whatever came next, together. As the night stretched on, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. And the truth, as painful as it was, would finally be revealed. The sun was rising as Jake and the girl made their way to the final destination, the place that had always been in the back of Jake's mind. It was the place that had been hidden for so long, the warehouse where everything had begun, where the lies had been seeded and left to grow in the shadows. The journey had been long, and the closer they got, the heavier the weight of what was about to happen became. The truth was within reach, but Jake knew that what they found there would change everything. What they would expose could tear apart the very fabric of the past. They stopped in front of the warehouse, the doors looming large in front of them, their metal surface battered and old. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, just like the truth buried inside it. The girl stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the building. Her face had hardened over. The past few days, her eyes no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a quiet determination. She had seen so much, learned so much, and now she was ready to confront the legacy of lies that had defined her family for generations. Jake took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old memories. "This is it," he said quietly. The girl nodded. "Let's finish this." He nodded in return and walked toward the door, the girl close behind him. His hand hovered over the handle, but before he could open it, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "You really think you can just walk in and expose it all, don't you?" Jake's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the man standing behind them, a figure emerging from the shadows of the warehouse. The man was older, his face weathered, but his presence was unmistakable. He was part of the past, part of the network that had controlled everything. "Sam," Jake said, his voice full of disbelief and anger. You were behind this all along?" Sam stepped forward, his eyes cold but filled with something else, something Jake couldn't quite read. "I was a part of it," Sam said slowly. "But you've got it all wrong. You think you can just come in here and fix it? It's not that simple. It's bigger than you realize." Jake clenched his fists. "I'm done with the lies, Sam. I'm done protecting people who only care about themselves. You've had your chance to do the right thing. Now it's my turn." Sam's expression softened, just for a moment, as if he were considering something. "Jake," he said, his voice low and almost pleading. "You don't understand. The pact, the deal, it's not something we can just undo. It's embedded in everything, every part of our lives, our families. You can't just tear it all apart without consequences." Jake shook his head. "I've already made my decision. We're exposing the truth, Sam. It's time for everything to come to light. You can either help us or stand aside." Sam stood there for a long moment, his eyes searching Jake's face. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant acceptance settling in. "I knew this day would come," he muttered. "But I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't think it would be you." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go on. But know this. Once you walk in there, there's no turning back. You'll be part of something much bigger than you think." Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing in the silence of the warehouse. The girl stepped in behind him, her footsteps steady. The room was dim, the air stale with the scent of decay, but at the center of it all was the truth they had been searching for. On the table in front of them were more papers, more contracts, and in the center of it all, a photograph, a younger Jake's father, standing with a group of people he didn't recognize. "This is it," Jake whispered, picking up the photograph. "This is where it all started." The girl walked over to him, her hand brushing his arm. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jake looked at the photograph, his mind racing with the connections, the names, the faces that had been hidden for so long. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "we make sure the world knows the truth. We make sure no one can hide behind their lies anymore." He turned to face Sam, who had followed them into the room. "This ends now, Sam. No more secrets, no more hiding." Sam nodded, a grim look on his face. "It's all yours now, Jake," he said. But be careful. The world isn't ready for what you're about to unleash. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the papers on the table, flipping through them quickly. The documents were full of names, contracts, and dates. But the more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about his father. This wasn't just about her family. This was about power, manipulation, and a system that had been in place for far too long. And now, Jake had the power to bring it all crashing down. He turned to the girl, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice quiet. She nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." Jake took a deep breath and looked at Sam one last time. "We're finishing this. No more lies. No more secrets." As they left the warehouse, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The truth had been exposed. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, Jake knew one thing. There was no turning back now. I have written a captivating tale filled with intensity, intrigue, and suspense, perfect for fans of Hell Angel stories. The journey follows a determined biker as he unravels a dark family secret that has been buried for generations. As the story progresses, the biker and a young girl come together to expose the truth behind a dangerous pact that has shaped their lives. From hidden journals to mysterious warehouses, every step they take brings them closer to the powerful people who want to keep their secrets buried. With each twist and turn, the stakes get higher, and the truth about the Hell Angels stories begins to unfold. As they push forward, they face betrayal, danger, and a fight for justice, leading to an explosive conclusion that will change everything. This is not just another tale of rebellion. It is a gripping exploration of loyalty, lies, and the darkness of the past. For those who love thrilling Hell Angel stories, this journey offers an unforgettable ride. Don't miss the shocking revelations and heart-pounding moments that bring this epic tale of redemption to its final chapter.